Alrighty, welcome everyone. Now today we're going to be talking about one of my favourite teaching strategies, or at least one that I think is really important, that isn't really taught anywhere like a lot of these strategies, but is very, very important. Now, most teachers, teacher aides who are well trained will have come across this particular term, and that is think-alouds. Now, a think-aloud basically means that as you go through the process of modelling something for a student, whatever that may be, whether it's kicking a ball or some type of sports activity, doing an art project, maybe it's a maths problem, for example. As you go through that process, you're explaining to students how an expert would go about doing it. Now, there are basically 4 or 5 different things that you do while you're going through a think-aloud process. One of them obviously is that you model the actual activity. So that's probably the main thing. You're actually going through and doing what you want the student to be able to do. So you're producing a product or a part of that particular product. You're also going through and thinking of the different options, traps, and tricks. So general information that you can give students about what to do, what not to do, little traps that they might fall into that may seem logical or easy at the time, but actually means that the process takes a bit longer or is more difficult. With the options one, that's an important one too, because there are quite often multiple ways that, say, you could write a sentence or write a paragraph or design a resume or make a art product or paint a picture or whatever. So they've got various different options. So it's important that you explain during that think aloud process why you have gone through and chosen that option there, but not those options, and whether those options are viable and why or why not. So that's obviously important as well. It's the process and the steps, and particularly the steps and why you've divided it up or chunked that activity down into those particular steps, because you could divide a process down into 10 steps, into 2 steps, into 7 steps, into 75 steps. However you decide to divide it down, and the reason for that should be explained to students most of the time. And within those steps, you'll have easy ones, you'll have difficult ones, you might have long ones. So they're not actually difficult or easy, but they just take an actual long time to go through. So you can explain, this is an easy step, there's no real tricks to it, you just have to go through and do it, it's just a part of the process. This one's actually quite easy, but it takes a long time, so don't be confused by the difficulty of that step. And don't forget that you can add in sub-steps as well. Now, the other thing that you're going to be doing is, and I harp on about this a lot, so you're probably sick of it, you're going to be adding in those metacognitive skills, so such as being able to divide things into processes, being able to divide different tasks into chunks to make life a little bit easier, and so on and so forth. So again, I've got a video on metacognitive skills where I go through probably 20 or 30 of the most common ones. Please watch that, because I think it's really important to add that in to the overall, to all of these types of activities in your day-to-day teaching. It's important to add in as many metacognitive skills as you can, or at least to focus on 2 or 3 and to really nail those 3 or 4 metacognitive skills over a period of time so that they become entrenched habits in your students. And there was one more that I was going to put up there that has since escaped me, so I'll just erase it. We'll come back to that in a minute anyway. So I just wanted to go through something, I guess something of an example, so that that's what it was. So one of the other aspects of think-alouds that are really important is existing knowledge. So you're bridging new knowledge with existing knowledge, and I've done another video on that, please watch that one, but that's an important aspect of think-alouds, and that leads me to another one actually, which is checking for understanding. So a part of that process is you're basically asking students questions and so on and so forth. So a pure think aloud is where you have a model expert who goes and models something and goes through and explains it on the board and whatnot. But in reality, in the real world, best practice is to be going backwards and forth and checking for understanding. And that's sort of a formative assessment task. It can be just by looking at students, you get an idea for whether they're understanding what's going on. It can actually be asking actual questions or asking them to do aspects of a particular task. And that happens as you're going through the process. So if it's a 3-step activity, then you might stop at each particular step and make sure that students understand it, or you may get them to do activities. Because as you're doing, if there is a particular task you want them to do, there's nothing wrong with doing just one step of that, and then students go off and practice and so on and so forth, and then continuing your think aloud for that product later on. You don't have to do it all in one go from start to finish. There are various different ways that you can go about doing it. Okay, but it is important to link what students already know to this new product and or the new task or process or whatever it is, body of knowledge, whatever it is that they're learning or skills that they're developing and so forth, because students always bring with them a bunch of ideas, a bunch of knowledge, a bunch of skills. Sometimes they're incorrect, but at least they're bringing that with them, and that's sort of your starting point. So you're never starting from zero, you're always starting from, say, 20% or something like that. So watch my video on that one. So I just wanted to do a quick example of a think aloud using what I always use, which is a Venn diagram. So we'll just go through and just do a quick little example over here. I'll just leave that there and we'll change pen and I'll put my teacher hat on. Okay, so today what we're doing is going through and learning about Venn diagrams. This is where I would ask students if they could help me explain what a Venn diagram was and why we would use it. So we'd have a little bit of a conversation there about that. Now, the first thing I want to do is figure out whether I should be using a Venn diagram and why I would use a Venn diagram. Now, in this case, I've got a bit of a worded question, right? So I have students who like English as a subject, and I have a bunch of students who like history as a subject, and I've got students who like both. Okay, so there are 3 categories of people. And the thing with Venn diagrams is that it enables us to graphically see the relationship between these different groups of people. And we're going to start off and have a look at some very simple examples to begin with. So now let's say there are 6 students who like English in a survey or whatever. There are 3 students in this survey who like history, and there are 2 students who like both. Now that's assuming as well that we've only done a small number of surveys here, but obviously, yeah, and it's related to different topics. So we'll go on and talk about some different examples in a minute. But again, we'll just do something very simple here. Now, this is where we'd stop and have a discussion about why we're doing these different circles and what other possible options could go into these different circles. So this one, what would I write? What if I had a little title here for that circle, what would I write there? And this is where I would probably be getting students to come up and write in the answers there and asking them about whether we could swap it over. Why can't we use triangles? You do get Venn diagrams that are more oval shaped and things. And particularly you might have seen more complicated ones that sort of encircle those, and then there's other little circles around it and things. But basically, if you can get students to understand that, then those more complicated ones take a bit more time to read or to understand, but they're pretty much the same. But anyway, so I would get students to come up and probably try and figure out what we would put there and have a chat about what that circle represents. We'd probably even do that separate to begin with. That's usually, I would say that would be a good way to do it. And even better if we can draw it and stick it somehow on the whiteboard with just a bit of tape or whatever, and one of them can be transparent, and then we can put them together. So that might be a good way of doing that as well, if you've got the time to do a little bit of preparation there. You probably don't need to, but it might have a bit of a, it might just look cool, I guess. So anyway, and then I would get other students to come up and say, okay, so we've got 6 students who really like English. How would we go about drawing that? So let's say we've got English here. 6 students who really like English. So we'd get students to come up and go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And again, we might have a chat about and say, well, what is the difference between here, 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 and so forth? And then we'll get someone else to come up, and I might ask them to do the other side. So we've got 1, 2, 3 there, and then in the middle we've also got 2. Okay. Now, what I'm actually doing here, going through this with students, is more of a, just as much what is known as a worked example. Now, a worked example, pretty much the same as a think aloud. A worked example is when you're going through and just putting it on the board and showing students how to do it. A think aloud probably takes that to the next step, in that you're actually going through and doing all of these things as well. Whereas this is just showing students, broadly the process. But they're pretty much the same thing, maybe slight differences there, but I don't think we're really too concerned. And you can see how while I do ramble on a little bit while I'm making these videos, but in a classroom setting, you'd try to keep it relatively simple, especially at this stage. So you probably wouldn't be talking about the more advanced ones and things. And we would probably also, as I've been doing, trying to get as much feedback and as much opportunities to respond, as much engagement with students as we can. Okay, so over here we did have our history. So this one was history. And then we've got 2 students who like both in the middle. The next question becomes really obvious, is where we're trying to figure out how many students have we got in total. So then you could ask everyone in the class to tally that up, write their answers on their piece of paper, not show their neighbour, and then ask students to put their hand up to tell me how many students are in the actual class. Now, that's how many students there are in total, or how many students were surveyed in total. Okay, that's the basics of that particular very, very simple think aloud. Now, quite often, if you were to do a pure think aloud, a very quick one, you might not actually be interacting with students, and depending on their age, if you were doing this as a quick revision, say for year 9s or 10s, as opposed to introducing it for the first time in year 5 or 6 or something like that, then what you might be doing is, as a revision task, you might not be asking for people to respond. You might quickly go through, spend 3 or 4 minutes and just demonstrate that on the board and talk about all these different things here. So different ways that we could do it and so on and so forth. I'm not a huge fan of doing it that way, but there is an argument, I guess, that is an option that you can pursue if you'd like to do it that way. I'm going to quickly show you how to do this, and you can do a quick one. And then you would do a second one where you're getting a lot of interaction from students, and it's more of a guided learning / shared learning scenario, even though you're going through and thinking about the different options and why you would put history on that side and English on this side, or if there even was a reason, which in this case there isn't, and why we've done circles instead of squares, and so on and so forth. So that's the basics of a think aloud. I've actually used a lot of think alouds as I was going through and doing various different things and explaining them in these webinars. So if you have been listening to various different ones, such as quizzes. So if you've watched the quizzes one, I went through and did, I think it was a 10-question quiz. I only did that very recently. So that was kind of a think aloud. I was sort of going through and explaining the different options and where I would include different types of questions and why I did this question and not that question, and so on and so forth. So as I was constructing that quiz, I was going through and explaining what my thinking was why I chose this, why I chose that, why I didn't choose this, what other options were available, and so on and so forth. Now, think-alouds are also really important, not just when you're working on the board and you're talking to all students and the whole class or groups or whatever, but as you circulate around the room, think-alouds are also really important for when you're sitting down or crouching down and you're just helping one student in a one-on-one scenario, going through and saying, okay, what is the process to work out this particular worked example, or what is the process to work out this particular question? And how do we tackle it? So here's what I would do. Let's go through and let's do one, and I'll explain what my brain's thinking as I go through and do it. So first thing I'm going to do is this. Then I'm going to go through and do this. Then I'm going to do this, and I'm not going to do that, but I could, and then I'm going to do this, and so on and so forth. So that is a think aloud. The same go. It can just be a 30-second think aloud. It can be a 5-minute think aloud. It can take 20 minutes. And so on and so forth. So that's the basics of thinking aloud, of think-alouds, as I understand it. Don't be too concerned about whether you're introducing other topics in there or other teaching strategies, like the modelling and shared and guided learning and opportunities to respond. It's not a strategy that's been designed to use on its own. It's used as a part of a range of other techniques and best practice strategies, such as we were saying, those opportunities to respond from students, questioning techniques, feedback. You could use it as a part of games and quizzes and so on. So that is think-alouds.